Good afternoon, and welcome to today's IPI Speaker Series event, A Peacekeeper in Africa, Learning from UN Interventions in Other People's Wars. I'm Jake Sherman, director of the Brian Urquhart Center for Peace Operations here at IPI, and it is a real pleasure to welcome Alan Doss, our speaker today. Now president of the Kofi Annan Foundation, Alan spent 40 years in the service of the United Nations, working on peacekeeping, development, and humanitarian assignments around the world. These assignments included UN peacekeeping appointments as a special representative of the UN Secretary General in Liberia, and then in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, as well as Deputy Special Representative and Humanitarian Coordinator in Sierra Leone and Principal Deputy Representative in Côte d'Ivoire. These missions were deployed in response to brutal rebellions in the case of Sierra Leone and Liberia, violent political crisis in Côte d'Ivoire, and in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, a regional war. They were part of the biggest and longest running expansion of UN peacekeeping, and they pioneered now standard features of peacekeeping missions, including, starting in Sierra Leone, the first protection of civilians mandate and the first integrated mission. 3 of these missions are now concluded and largely success stories. Excuse me. The DRC, while still struggling, may finally be on its own glide path following last year's transition of power. Alan's new book, which I hope you'll all be able to get a copy of, recounts his experience in the leadership of these 4 missions and offers reflections on what went right and what didn't in each of these cases, as well as lessons that might offer important instruction for the future of peacekeeping. It's a great read, and it's fantastic to have Alan with us today. So please welcome Alan Doss.
Well, thanks very much, Jake. Well, thank you to everybody for being here today. It's good to see particularly some old friends and colleagues from my UN and particularly peacekeeping days. And thanks for giving me a little bit of your lunchtime. I want to start with, of course, a special word of thanks to IPI and to the President, Terry Rood Larson, who sponsored the book and which, quite frankly, might not otherwise have seen the light of day. And he also wrote a very nice, generous, warm introduction. I spent about 40 plus years writing 2-page memos. And it's a bit of a challenge to get beyond that. But when you do, there's another challenge, which is when to actually stop, because it starts pouring out. But luckily, I fell into the hands of a great publisher, Lynn Rayner, who's here today. And Lynn and her team gave me a lot of good advice and actually made the book a lot more readable than it would otherwise have been. But so too did Adam Lupel, the vice president, and Jake Sherman. They read the manuscript, offered a lot of advice, suggestions to make it a much more focused project, and their team as well helped a lot with the manuscript. So, as I said in the introduction, no life is lived alone, and no book is put together alone. So thank you, everybody who helped make it possible. And there are other colleagues in the room who also contributed, and I apologize for any plagiarism that may have crept into the text. So the question is, why did I write this book? Well, to be honest, there was some degree of vanity involved, but I did so principally for 4 reasons. First, peacekeeping operations, my experience was truly extraordinary over those 10 years or close to 10 years, and I felt it would be useful, perhaps vainglorious, to share some of those experiences with those who might be wonder, how do these things happen? How do you put together a mission that brings together people from all over the world, kaleidoscope of humanity, but who are there for a reason, but not to impose their will, not to conquer territory, but to actually try to put a country back together again. I mean, that as I've said in the book, that is an extraordinary achievement in the annals of human endeavor, and particularly human warfare. I quote an Indian peacekeeper who was with me in the DRC, who said, he got to put his finger right on it. He said, "You don't go to war in tanks painted white." Reference to the UN, big white vehicles and so forth. So you've put together people who have no direct interest in the country. They're not affected by the country. They're not even necessarily neighbors. Their interest is they intervene, but they're intervening in what I called other people's wars. And I think that's a unique endeavor in human history and human warfare. Secondly, I wanted to humanize peacekeeping and illustrate, the many challenges and dilemmas that face peacekeepers every single day they're in the field. We tend to forget that. It tends to get lost in the great wash of commentary on peacekeeping, much of which, to be very honest, is very negative. And it's negative because of failings in peacekeeping, and particularly grievous misbehavior among some peacekeepers. And that needs to be recognized. And I think I've tried to be very honest in recognizing those failings in my book, and also admitted to my own mistakes. And believe me, there were quite a few. On the other hand, or nevertheless, even though those mistakes and that behavior has compromised severely the UN's reputation, I felt very strongly it shouldn't stop there. Because every day I saw people going out and doing a decent, good job, often at great risk to themselves. And I was very keen to make sure that all sides are presented, and that's often forgotten, that we have a lot of good people who are out there, day in, day out, in terrible conditions, who are trying to make a difference. And I wanted to show that in the book, without glossing over the failings and the failures, and particularly when it's in the area of sexual abuse and exploitation. The third reason was I wanted to express some thoughts about Africa. I spent quite a bit of time in Africa, but I am not an Africanist and I'm not a historian. I don't pretend to tell the story of Africa. But much of what's written about Africa is wrong, misleading, and above all, it's ahistorical. It doesn't look back. Where did we get to where we are today? Where we put peacekeepers into a country to solve problems which may have their origins decades, centuries earlier on. Good measure because of colonialization, because of the slave trade and so forth. So I thought it was very important that when I talk about countries, we should have a snapshot of where that country has come from, because it profoundly influences what we can or cannot do today. So I've tried to do that, and I've tried to take heed of William Faulkner's famous words that the past is not dead, it's not even past. And that is so true, I think, in many countries in Africa today. But recognize, too, that this is a small subset of Africa. There are dozens of African countries, vibrant countries, great societies, all kinds of things are happening. So I wanted to try to get the balance right. And then finally, actually this happened as I was writing the book. I've been at this book off and on for several years, to be honest. Much of it was written on long plane rides to odd places around the world. But during the latter period, you know better than I, you're all here in New York, the international environment has not improved. It's becoming more difficult. I think it's no secret for the United Nations, for multilateral cooperation. And what disturbs me is that as a result, much of the good work that can and should be done is being downplayed, is being marginalized. And it seems to me there's a danger there, a great danger, that these unique instruments of intervention that the UN has developed over not just a few years, but over decades, would get left behind, and that we would lose sight of that. And I think it's really important that we don't do that. We're going through a difficult period, but we've done that before. It's 60 years ago this year, July actually, that the first multidisciplinary UN mission was set up in the Congo, ONUC. It ran very much into the headwinds of the Cold War, some of you may know. It was reasonably successful. It closed down after 3.5, 4 years. And then peacekeeping went into the deep freeze for about 20, 30 years, and gradually came out when the Cold War began to end. I hope we won't go into the deep freeze again, because what we see, a lot of minor wars, that if they're not properly handled, if they're not contained, become big wars. Proxies get involved, and then we know what can happen. So I think we should be very careful not to allow UN peace operations, including peacekeeping, to fall into a disrepair. But I do make some suggestions towards the end of the book, with the help of Adam and Jake and others, about making peacekeeping fit for future purpose. The world is not standing still, and nor can peacekeeping. So with that, I hope you enjoy the book. It's not an academic work, but I hope it's more than a string of anecdotes, but you will be finally the judge. So thank you again for coming today. Thank you.
All right, Alan. So I wanted to maybe start the discussion with, there's an observation that you make at one point in the book where you distinguish between diplomacy and politics.
Yeah.
And over the course of your career in peacekeeping, you've dealt with some fairly unsavory characters. And the book talks about Issa Sise in Sierra Leone, who took over command of the RUF from Foday Senko, Prince Johnson in Liberia, responsible for the murder of Samuel Doe, of course later elected to the National Senate, Laurent Gbagbo and his wife in Cote d'Ivoire, and of course Laurent Kabila in the DRC. And you emphasize that a key aspect of your role, first as DSRSG and later as SRSG, was to maintain a working relationship with rebel leaders, many of whom, in your words, were violent psychopaths, and with host governments that were, again quoting you, abusive, repressive, and unresponsive. So I wonder if you could talk a bit about your approach to, on one hand, having to deliver tough messages, and at the same time having to maintain access and influence in a sense of the perception of the UN's impartiality.
Yeah, well, I think that was a key dilemma in just about, particularly the countries that were right in the middle of a crisis. You know, it is true, you have to deal with a lot of people who are not exactly examples of enlightened humanity. But they're there, whether we like it or not. That doesn't mean to say we excuse or exonerate them or turn a blind eye, but you do have to deal with them, and you have to listen to them. The interesting thing is I found many of them were actually very good communicators. They were better communicators than we were in the UN, because they were very simple messages, sound bites, and the international media, mediators, well-meaning individuals lapped it up. You know, they could get an audience. We were a bit flat-footed. We would struggle sometimes to get perspective across. But it was true with governments as well. I mean, governments are there. Many of them, what we found, the longer a mission stayed, and it happened in 2 or 3 countries, the longer we stayed, the greater the divergence between what we were expected to do per the council mandates and what those governments expected us to do. And this became a major issue, frankly, in the DRC, which saw us as, frankly, an enforcer for what the FARDC couldn't do. And that, by the way, was a repeat of history, because Brian Urquhart and Ralph Bunche had gone through exactly the same problem, you know, then 50 years before with Lumumba. You read Bunche's memoirs, and you'll see how frustrated he was in dealing with Lumumba, to the point where eventually he asked to leave. So I'm not saying history repeats itself, but it does rhyme, to quote Mark Twain. So I think this has been this problem. How do you bring those? There's a growing divergence, cleavage between, and particularly, you know, with the mandate that you have, covers a whole range, and these mandates became ever more complex as the mission lengthened. We never actually stopped and said, well, look, let's you know, draw a line and start with a new mandate. We rolled over task after task. So, and that included, of course, things like human rights provisions in line with the position of the Council and of course, the Secretary General. But governments that invite peacekeeping missions into their countries don't usually expect them to come in and start criticizing them about human rights. And I found that it became very difficult when we had to go out and publicly say this is wrong. Because, it's easy to denounce a militia, because everybody's against rebels, right? It's much more difficult when it comes to the host government. And that did require considerable certain diplomacy, but also political common sense. What I personally found was the best way to handle this often was that we try to get government to take on a policy as its own and announce it, not us. It was much more palatable that way, because it didn't look as if they were bowing to international pressures and giving in to them. But on times, yes, and we did this, not just in the DRC, we had to say we disagree and disagree publicly. The problem always, especially for an SRSG, is how to divorce the message and the messenger. And quite frankly, that gets exacerbated because who speaks for the UN? All kinds of people come to a mission. The only people I could control were those who were in the mission. But if X, Y, or Z came from this organization in the UN system or whatever and made public statements, they got on a plane, I could say, well, this isn't the mission, but the UN is the UN. And this complicated also our ability to sort of set and influence the agenda. But to be honest, that's part of the job, and that's what you have to accept. And even though and over time, missions lose influence. It's what I call the sovereignty reasserts itself. As governments become more confident, they feel they're in more control, they're less likely to listen to you, to be honest. They feel they're in charge. And one way of showing that to their political parties and the rest of it is to publicly disagree with the UN and the SRSG. That's a fact of life, frankly. And you have to accept that as you move forward and find ways around it. You mentioned the issue, I'll stop on this point. There is a difference between diplomacy and politics. I'm not sure we always understand that. A lot of our staff in our so-called political sections came from the diplomatic side of life, not from practicing in politics. And there is a big difference. Diplomacy, in my view, is about the alignment of interests, convergence of interest. Politics is about the pursuit of interests. And this becomes very clear in peacekeeping missions, where we're more interested in the alignment of interest to push the peace process forward, whereas those in power are much more interested in the pursuit of their own interests, often in contradiction to what you may be trying to achieve under the mandate of the mission.
You actually raise 2 points that I want to touch on. One that maybe we'll come back to is this idea of the ability of the UN system to speak with one voice. But maybe before we go there, this point about the divergence between expectations and reality. In the book, you refer to it as the expectations trap. And I think in the book, it's raised in the context of peace agreements and the fact that for the most part, the UN depends on governments that are willing to execute peace agreements in good faith.
Yeah.
And you note that at one point you say that the Security Council should periodically take pruning shears to those mandates and not simply roll them over. Above all, there has to be a realistic assessment of success, speaking about this gradual accumulation of tasks over time. And it seems, certainly since the Hippo report 5 years ago or so, there has been, one hears a lot more about the need to better prioritize, better sequence mandates. And I wonder, looking back on the missions that you served in, are there particular examples of tasks that at the time you would have wished you could have had the council take its pruning shears to?
Well, first, just to pick up on your introductory remarks, Jake, I think as everybody in this room will know, peace agreements don't actually make peace. It's what follows. And in all 4 countries, 4 missions I was in, we were deployed on the basis of a peace agreement. And only in one did that peace agreement hold up, which was the comprehensive peace agreement in Accra for Liberia. That, by the way, came after 17 failed agreements. So, the sense that, well, a mission's arrived, the future's here, everything will be well, is very misleading. And I think we should be aware of that, be very careful, particularly when it comes to protection of civilians and so forth, where much of the concern has arisen since Kofi Annan's report in 1999, if memory serves. So I think we tend to create these expectations of what a mission can achieve without really seriously looking at if that is viable. This is why I call the chapter, Great Expectations, the Conceit of Intervention. And I have a very interesting quote there from, if you'll see, from the French revolutionary, whose name, of course, temporarily escapes me. Anyway, who says, basically, the belief that somehow countries will welcome the intervention of armed missionaries is not true. And we certainly found that. Some welcomed us, but not everybody by any means, because, depending on their position, we were seen as interlopers who really were there just to prop up one faction or one government. So I think it's, again, what we expect is not always what we get. And when that happens, disappointment sets in, and then confidence in the mission begins to crumble. And that is very hard to deal with. I was in missions where that happened, and I saw what the consequences were. It's very debilitating. And as I say, if you get missions where one task after another is added on. Let me give you a concrete example. The Congo, of course. Been there 20 years. Probably this year we'll see about, over those 20 years, about roughly between 19 and $20 billion have been spent. And I was part of that, to be honest. And there's been maybe 50, 60 resolutions over those 20 years, at least, covering MONUC and then things like sanctions regimes. Just about every one of them concerning MONUC, MONUSCO, refers to ending impunity. Mm-hmm. Every one. Have we ended impunity in the Congo? No. Should we keep trying? Yes. But let's be realistic. We keep adding things in missions that are not capable of dealing with it. Another one was in the Côte d'Ivoire where arms embargoes were imposed, and the mission was asked to basically provide surveillance for the implementation of that arms embargo. Maybe one or two a year have been on those groups of experts that the Council establishes. Well, quite frankly, it was impossible for us to monitor arms embargoes. There are thousands of crossing points from Côte d'Ivoire into Burkina Faso, into Liberia, into Ghana, etc. But we were then held to account for monitoring those sanctions in terms of, we couldn't even get into the port of Abidjan. We tried to do that through military observers. And what were we going to do? Shoot our way into the port? Clearly it was not going to happen. So what I'm saying is I think there is a real need for the Council from time to time to stop, take stock and say, really, we've been at this for X number of years. Is this really realistic? And if not, why not? I think that's particularly important in the case of civilian protection, where we have created, rightly, these expectations that the arrival of peacekeepers means the end of violence against civilians. Now, it's not written that way, I know. But I think we've really there created a huge dilemma. Because there is no way in the Eastern Congo you're going to stop violence against civilians without some fundamental changes in the way the Congo is run. Mm-hmm. The UN cannot do that. The peacekeepers cannot do that. So let's be realistic amongst ourselves and try to get that debate and discussion going before we make these mandates. If we're going to have a civilian protection of civilian mandate, then ask yourself, who are we trying to protect the civilians from? We can't just protect civilians from the failings of their own governments, can we? But we don't ask that, and we don't have that discussion. And I saw recently just this recent note from the discussions with I think the Korean government is going to host a ministerial.
That's right.
There's a whole section there on protection of civilians. It's important, but it's not about protection strategy. It's about the mechanics of protection. And we spend a lot of time in the Congo on the mechanics. I mean, some of us are here. I'm looking at friends from around the table who work with me on this. And we did quite well, things like liaison assistance and joint protection patrols. But at the end of the day, we were not solving the fundamental problem. We had a protection policy, but we didn't have a political strategy that would have made it possible.
Maybe just to follow up on that, there's been a lot of focus and attention recently on the idea of missions having clear political strategies with which to implement their mandates. And you talk in one point at the book about quite explicitly saying actually what you don't need is another strategy. Right. What you need is more of a security political policy. And I wonder if maybe you'd say a little bit more about that.
Well, I got kind of overwhelmed by strategies. Again, there are people in this room, Dimitri among others, Kevin and so forth, who work with me on these strategies. But we became a strategy factory, and I was the general manager of that factory. For every problem, we had to have a strategy. But the reality is and they took forever to, by the way, when you try to do it in an inclusive, consensual manner, they become all-consuming. And because they take so long to produce, they get stuck. And then, you can't modify or adjust them. So I think we should back off a little bit on strategies, take the council mandate, and then ask the missions to produce their own political security approach, where you would drill down and look at those key elements of the mandate and say, well, what does this require us to do in the context of where we are, wherever it may be? And sometimes I think we're going to find there are fundamental contradictions in terms of what we're expected to do and what we can do. But then because it's an internal mission policy, if you will, it can be adjusted and changed much more rapidly than if you have a strategy that's been built as such that involves the whole UN system. One of the last things I did in the Congo, much to my regret, was to work on an integrated strategic framework. Oh, God. Never ask me to do that again. I'd shoot myself. It's just unbelievable, the amount of time and effort. And, we all want to be part of it, but then, of course, everybody has their agenda and it became all-consuming, and frankly, we weren't doing the things, we were strategizing, we weren't actually doing. And I think that's something we should be aware of. So that's why I suggested that, let's get missions to work on their own internal efforts to say, well, what does this actually mean? What can we do? The Council's asked us with these broad mandates, what does that actually mean? And then review it, change it, adjust it. But don't go through that whole strategy. We had at least half a dozen strategies for everything in the Congo, frankly. And as I say, but also in Sierra Leone, when working on transition, we had 3, 4, 5 strategies. And afterwards, I realized that it was all-consuming. And above all, particularly in places like the Sierra Leone, to some extent, we avoided that trap, I think, in Liberia, is that, we're working with very weak governments that are emerging from many years of crisis and no resources. And instead of helping to build capacity, we're actually draining capacity with our demands, donor demands. And that, frankly, is not helpful. Stick to a few priorities, try to make sure they're implemented, stay with them, and then, as need be, adjust and change them.
You raised the point about the pain of working on an integrated strategic framework, and the idea of integration is a recurring theme throughout the book. This idea of the internal coherence of the UN system, of trying to pull together as one, particularly between the peacekeeping mission and the UN country team, although you also talk quite a bit about efforts to corral within the peacekeeping mission the various disparate bits. And as you said in your remarks, you, over a long career in the UN, you started actually with the UN Development Program and then went on to be the first triple hat DSRSG, responsible for coordinating development and humanitarian response. And as I noted, this is now standard, right? Pretty much every multidimensional integrated mission has a triple hat. And this seems like something that the UN has been on at for, let's say, at least 2 decades now. And it's an issue that I think it continues to struggle with. We've just seen Secretary General Guterres push through another round of reforms aimed at breaking down silos, and there's a lot of sensitivities, not least from humanitarian agencies, but indeed from the development side as well. So I wonder, we're at a point where we're seeing a big wave of peacekeeping closures, including a number of the missions in which you worked, I think probably more on the horizon. So thinking about transitions, where do you think this cooperation is most important, and what are the potential risks?
Well, I think it's worth recalling, Jake, as I do in the book, how that all got started. It arose, like many initiatives and innovations, from failure, from a crisis, and that was in Sierra Leone back in 2000, when the RUF reneged on the Lomé Agreement, and with consequences, and it showed there was great deep dysfunctionality within the mission itself, to be honest, but also between the mission and the UN country team and the humanitarian community. And it got very nasty, to be honest. And when Mr. Annan went there, there was, again, I recount that in the book, there's a little sort of insight which illustrated the problem, because one of his colleagues on the mission told me this later, so it was first-hand knowledge. When he got to the airport, he was very surprised. There was nobody at the airport from the UN country team there. Mm-hmm. Nobody. It was just, the peacekeeping mission. And he found that very strange because he'd worked a lot in the system. So, and then, of course, he discovered there was a complete breakdown of relations between peacekeeping mission had done. And these things always get exacerbated in times of crisis, let's be honest. That's when things really get tough. So that's why he decided he needs to get a better fit. That's why he created the post that I then took up in Sierra Leone. I think the problem is always there, and it's not unique, by the way, to the UN. You see it in governments, despite all the talk about whole of government approaches. You get it in governments, you get it in the private sector, the regional people versus the business people versus the engineering people. So it is a problem of human organization. And to my mind, the answer doesn't necessarily lie in drawing more boxes and more dotted lines or whatever it is. It really is about, and this came from my days as a resident coordinator, long before peacekeeping, is because everybody will claim a mandate. And when you start one of these discussions around with the word mandate, you're dead in the water. Because everybody will claim they have a mandate, however minor or tangentially it might be. And I saw this, by the way, in some of what was then the Secretary General's Policy Committee. I mean, you'd have 30 people in the room, all claiming to have something to do with the mission and their mandate. And of course, nothing came out of it, really. To my mind, the only way forward is actually to put the problem in the middle, not the mandate. Say, look, we have this problem, protection of civilians. Who can do what? Where can you come together? Where can you help us on this? Not by sort of drawing lines and adjudicating and allocating responsibility. Because if you started that way, I mean, sadly, you may think I'm being cynical, but often this is about resources. You sort of have a presence and you then use that to drum up resources. Whereas what it has to be is about who can do the job and who has got capacities to do it. And that doesn't follow in a straight line. So I always found in these things when I was resident coordinator, then afterwards as DSRG and even as SRG, let's put the problem in the middle. Let's see who comes up with the bright ideas as to how we can move forward this. Avoid mandates, whatever you do, discussion on mandates that, we're the X and therefore we have because increasingly those mandates overlap because it's the nature of the world. You cannot put things into silos. You cannot delineate them in very clear, neat responsibilities. So that's the way I try to solve it. But one thing we must always be aware of this is personalities play a role. I mean, frankly, even the best crafted approach, people don't get on, they don't get on. And although sometimes I have to say, it was easy to get agreement locally, and especially with the integrated strategic framework. We did something in Kinshasa, which was okay. By the time it got back up to headquarters, then it started to fall apart because everybody sees that thing through their institutional lens and it becomes that much more difficult. So I always try to avoid things being referred to headquarters because, frankly, that was often the kiss of death. I mean, institutional death. I mean, stay away from headquarters. Sorry about that. I also worked in headquarters at the other end of the tube, so I know of what I speak a little bit. So again, I think these are issues, lessons we've learned and applied. The integration model was not without its criticisms, and still is. I personally found it very immensely helpful, as I've tried to show here, particularly in Sierra Leone and then again in Cote d'Ivoire when I was the two-hatted, to have the capacities that came from the UN system. I think SRSGs in particular must be very careful not to be disdainful of the country team. Bring them in, use them, and let them share the limelight. Whenever I went out on a field mission, I always took somebody from the country team, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong, Evie, or Herbert. They were both there with me. Share the limelight and let them open the school, and you sit behind and let them take the credit for the new project. But it honestly paid off. Mm-hmm. They need to feel a part of it, and not just the SRG, because there is resentment of the big boy on the block, or big girl on the block. And so you have to manage those sensitivities and be aware of it. And frankly, particularly with our friends in the humanitarian sector, there were endless debates about humanitarian space, as you know, which continue on. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you just have to find ways to sort of get people to understand that the whole is bigger than the parts, and work together. But it will be there forever. As long as human beings are running these things, it's very hard. You can attenuate it, you can make it work, but you won't get rid of it, frankly. Mm. It'll always be there, those institutional rivalries. It is, though, however, I think to some extent, as the UN becomes more fragmented, there's a real risk that it'll go backwards. That's what I can see happening in some cases. So you're all still in the UN, so be aware of that.
Great. Thanks, Alan. See, we've got a big room, and I imagine there's quite a lot of questions and comments. So I'm gonna open up the floor, and before I do, I'd like to invite His Excellency Ambassador D. Maxwell Sakimaya, the permanent representative of Liberia, to share his thoughts. Please, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Mr. Islanders. It's good meeting you here, having contributed immensely towards peace in our country. The President of IPR, other excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, let me commence by saying thanks for the invitation to participate in this event. It is my humble pleasure to speak at this event of significant relevance to all of us, but particularly for my country that has come out of war, owing to immense support from the partners, including but not limited to the United Nations, the European Union, ECOWAS, the African Union, the United States of America, and many other national and international stakeholders. I must assert that since the completion of the 14-year-long civil carnage in Liberia, the United Nations has remained true to its promise in helping Liberia in consolidating peace and strengthening democracy. Peacekeeping globally is becoming increasingly challenging, particularly in Africa, which plays host to about half of the United Nations peacekeeping missions. There are countless number of factors to blame for the huge challenges for peacekeeping, among which are the growing threats from terrorism and diverse armed groups with different objectives, the inability to establish or properly tackle the root causes of conflicts in a given situation, the inability to mobilize or garner adequate resources, logistics, and personnel related, for example, for deployment, especially in a timely manner, and the improper coordination among nations contributing troops and other resources, just to name a few. Of these challenges, the inability to garner the adequate resources in terms of personnel and logistics is the most critical, as the provision of these will certainly set the basis for the success of a peace mission. We are exceedingly pleased that in spite of the enormous challenges posed to peacekeeping, the United Nations can still pride itself for the steady progress in maintaining world peace. Of course, when we speak of UN peacekeeping in Africa, a mention has to be made to Liberia, a country where the UN has had a very successful stint, just as it did in neighboring country Cote d'Ivoire. Nonetheless, we must not relent in transforming the way we keep the peace to ensure safety, especially for men, women, and children that do not bear arms, as well as our men and women in the field. The United Nations must approach peacekeeping in ways and manner that will respond to the changing environment and current realities, particularly when terrorism has taken a new shape and form, as well as the use of chemical weapons. We must also never underestimate the importance of properly managing transition. As in the case of Liberia, the adoption of UN Security Council Resolution 2333 was timely and appropriate and played a critical role in facilitating a smooth transition process, including from a peacekeeping presence to a UN country team. The resolution prolonged UNMISS stay and facilitated the transitional process in ensuring the protection of civilians and ensured that Liberia was appropriately advised on the reform of justice and security institutions and made efforts to combat sexual and gender-based violence. Then came in the Peace Building Commission, which took a further step in aiding the efforts of the Liberian government and UNMIL in developing a peace-building plan for Liberia, a major requirement of UN Resolution 2333, and further established and strengthened a resident coordinator's office, RCO, which is very functional in Liberia up to present. As a result of these achievements, Liberia has been able to demonstrate resilience to challenges. We have had 17 years of uninterrupted peace and have held 3 peaceful and democratic presidential and legislative elections, 2005, 2011, and the most recent 2017, which brought to power His Excellency Dr. George Manneh Weah as President of the Republic of Liberia. As a country, we also take pride being considered a model country for successful transitions from peacekeeping to peace building, and also from conflict to building resilience and lasting peace. In spite of this, more needs to be done to further consolidate the gains made, as well as address current economic challenges so as to strengthen the resilience and ensure the sustenance of peace, security, and democracy in Liberia. I would like to close on what I would perceive as an ideal approach or advice that will guarantee successful peacekeeping as well as for transition purposes. 1. Before a peacekeeping mission is deployed, the root causes of the conflict should be fully diagnosed and understood, as well as the social, cultural, and political practices of a country. And in case of transition, the social, political, and economic status of the country as well should be assessed in order to take appropriate measures during the period of the transition. Prices of major export commodities of Liberia had declined on the global market, thereby further strangulating the economy of Liberia. We did not adequately prepare as a country for this. UNMIL's exit also increased the number of unemployed. 2. Any peacekeeping mission should have a clear mandate and strategy and the appropriate resources, including personnel, logistics, and finances, should be mobilized before deployment. 3. Political will of the country will be pivotal to ensure success of the mission. 4. Attention should be given to political events, capacity, and infrastructure gaps, and plans should be made in advance on how to fill such gaps, particularly in the case of a drawdown. In the case of Liberia, the drawdown took effect in the face of the major and historic election. In my view, which should not have been the case. The then incoming administration of His Excellency President Weah should have been given the opportunity to participate in such decision making, as that transition was the first in Liberia for more than 73 years, with the last being since 1944. The security apparatus was not adequately prepared to easily handle the transferred responsibilities from UNMIL, particularly considering the size of the Liberian army and police force. This indeed was a challenge, but we together surmounted somehow. 5. To ensure a smooth transition process, there should be national ownership and the full participation of all the stakeholders, women and youth, government leaders, civil society, and the rest. 6. Investing in a partnership between the government, the United Nations, peacekeepers, and other bilateral donors is key, as well as forging partnership with regional and sub-regional actors and bodies. 7. Peace missions should work concomitantly with key structures, security apparatus, justice system, just to name a few, of a given country during their execution of their mission, leading up to phasing out, not necessarily nearing the end of the mission. As a matter of fact, transitions should be an integral part of plans for peacekeeping right from the onset. And lastly, peace mission should take a more holistic approach, dealing with social, political, economic, and developmental issues involving all the parties. These are among the many reasons Liberia, under the leadership, these are among the many reasons Liberia, under the astute leadership of His Excellency President Weah, supports the UN Secretary General's Action for Peacekeeping initiative, which aims to address most of the concerns of peacekeeping. As we sat and listened to Mr. Islanders, Liberia as a country, under His Excellency President Weah, we never hold back whenever we have the opportunity in whatever related fora to, on behalf of His Excellency President Weah, the government and people of Liberia, to pay tribute and commend from the depth of our hearts our international partners, the United Nations and all international partners, the entire international community, for the invaluable role played in bringing Liberia to where we are today. For me personally, we've maintained that the conflict in Liberia in the first place was senseless. There can be no justification for such a conflict that led to the death of more than 250,000 Liberians and some other residents in our country at that time, which came also at the price of peacekeepers. Today, as a country, as we endeavor to move our country further in terms of growth and development in our country, we don't also hold back in reminding our international partners that the need to keep an eye on Liberia cannot be overly emphasized in an effort to prevent a relapse, because such will not only be so painful to our country, but also to the international community that spent over 15 billion United States dollars in addition to human and material resources to get us as a country to where we are. There can be no trade-off for peace, democracy, and security in our country. But as we pursue that, we cannot also do away with underscoring the disconnect between development and peacekeeping. That has, for the most part, affected most countries and led to relapse. The bread and butter issues, the livelihood of our people is of most concern. No matter how much we push for peace, those factors that support the sustenance of peace, security, and democracy must be given consideration by all well-meaning friends of Liberia. And in such consideration, the economy will be looked at. The need to have a strengthening economy, because when the economy is strengthening, our people will go about their lives. Finally, Africa's robust partnership with the United Nations will continue to prove productive in our shared endeavor for peace, security, and stability of Africa, and by extension, the rest of the world. I thank you.
Ambassador, many thanks for, I think, sharing the very valuable experience of your country and its transition from civil war to peace. I think it's a good reminder of the limits of what peacekeeping can achieve and the need to maintain a focus even after the departure of a peacekeeping mission to address many of the structural drivers of instability that remain, and want to thank you for those remarks. We're now going to open up the floor. We have a bit of time, so we'll take a group of questions and then revert. So I've got one in the back. All right, 1, 2, Walter, and then over to the side. and then another in the back. Let's start in the back.
Could they ask, say who they are?
Yeah, and if you could please introduce yourselves.
Thank you very much. Cornelia Walter, I've been for the past 2 decades with the UN in the field, not with peacekeeping, but so much of what you say sounds sadly familiar, including the factor of factory farming of strategies. So I was wondering, looking at the present dynamics, the shifts that are required to allow the UN to optimize its potential requires a quite tricky balance of institutional and individual changes. And seeing your experience, do you think that is going in the right direction? And related to that, what's the role of the Kofi Annan Foundation in that? Thank you.
And there was another just in front there. No. Yeah.
Thank you for this. My name is Faraz. I'm from UN Office for Counterterrorism. My question is with regards to the peacekeeping. Which countries in the African part were the most challenging in terms of peacekeeping? Thank you.
Walter Dorn, I teach at the Royal Military College of Canada about peace operations. I have a question for you about success of peacekeeping. Most commentaries on peacekeeping focus on the negative side, and I think your commentary was pretty much along that line, whether it be protection of civilians, arms embargoes, doctrine factories, and mandate discussions. I want to ask you, what did the UN do well? What's inspiring that we can take with us and challenge those who want to say that peacekeeping really doesn't work and that it's a very ineffective instrument?
Great, thanks, Walter. And then over on the side here.
My name is Ram Chaluri from Princeton, International Committee for Peace and Reconciliation. What I want to ask you is, as opposed to the leadership that was mentioned for most of the African countries, the leadership of the developed countries now are acting like almost like dictators. In this situation, what would be, how do you maintain peace between even the large countries? If you were to take, for example, Iran, US at one time was ready to go bomb Iran. Now, what kind of peace mission would stop such a thing in the future?
Oh, and Annie.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Annie with IPI. What recommendations do you have to address sexual exploitation and abuse in peacekeeping missions? Thanks.
All right, if I say that this is going to be the only round of questions, does anybody else want to put their hand up before I give the floor back to Alan? No, okay. So, Alan?
Yeah, well, some of those go beyond what I would say my experience, particularly in peacekeeping. These are large questions, some of them. But let me start with the first one about institutional changes, if I understood correctly, and the present dynamics, and is that going to help or hurt the process if I basically understand the core question, and then of course the role of the foundation. Well, the UN's just gone through a process of reform, changing, a new set of boxes, if I can put it that way. I think, to be honest, I think it's too early to judge. You know, I'm often reminded, I think I mentioned this again in the book, sort of a little story that Kofi Annan would recount that when he, and that's how I came into this whole thing with peacekeeping and stuff, was via his reform program of, well, it's 25 years ago actually, the late 90s, and I came to New York and one thing led to another. And he tells a story about, he was having his monthly luncheon with Security Council members, and one of the members berated him on the slow progress of the reform process and said, you know, Mr. Annan, this is taking too long. You know, we were expecting action, early action. And he then went on to say, you know, you say you need time, but God created the earth and the heavens in 6 days. why is it taking you so long to do some UN reform? To which Kofi's reply was, well, you know, God worked alone. I have to work with 15 members of the Security Council. So I think it's worthwhile reiterating that. We have to see where the current reform effort will go. Will it solve some of these problems? You know, will it make it possible for the UN to respond more effectively to the sort of crises that are emerging? I think, though, we should set it in context. The UN has gone through waves of periods of when the context was more amenable to change and to institutional reform. Certainly that was true when the Cold War came to an end, and for about a decade and a half more, I would say. You know, those who follow these things more closely may disagree. But I started in the UN when it was quite the opposite. I started in the 60s. I was here in the late 60s in New York. I was in the field before that. And it was very clear there was a stasis in the UN, and a sense that the UN was kind of pushed out. It was the Vietnam War particularly, and U Thant's efforts to find different ways to sort of help solve were shoved aside by principally the United States at the time. So there wasn't progress, and to the point where the funds and programs, I still remember this very clearly, put themselves at a distance from the political UN. Those are the guys who sat around the Security Council and couldn't, where we were out there doing things, you know, and this was UNDP, UNICEF, etc., HCR. So are we going back to that period now where we'll see limited willingness amongst the major powers to cooperate, to put together peacekeeping missions? I mean, the irony is that, you know, failed prevention makes peacekeeping that more likely. But it also makes putting together those missions that more difficult. And I think that's the great dilemma now. And above all, I think, I don't know if I said that already, that, you know, there's a danger that small wars become big wars. And if you don't contain them right front, and this is why I've said in the book, by the way, again, I may be diverging from what your question was, but what I call the peril of incrementalism. Well, we start small, we'll see how it goes. If the peace agreement works, okay. But it never, ever works that way. All of the missions I was involved in started that way, with the possible exception of Liberia for certain reasons, and then grew sometimes quite significantly, not in anticipation of crisis, but in response to crisis. And that ability of the UN to contain the situation, to create the time and space for political negotiations to go on, was compromised, frankly. So I think that's a challenge, but I would say again, let's see what happens in the next year or two with these, see if as these reforms are bedded in, I've had personally difficulty following the alphabet soup with all the new acronyms and so forth, but I don't think we should dismiss all of that out of hand. Let's see how it works, whether the integration in the field can work in its new configuration. We'll see. On the role of the Kofi Annan Foundation, the foundation is very much moving ahead. Sadly, as you all know, we lost Kofi 18 months ago. It was a terrible shock to everybody. But what he wanted, his values and his visions, were trying to make sure remain alive, which he wanted. He wanted that to go on, and I think that would be the best tribute and legacy, is to make sure that continues on. So we're doing a lot of work on elections and democracy, working with young people, because he was passionate about working with young people, and he was so right. You've got to bring young people in this. As he always said, you're never too young to lead, but you're never too old to learn. And I think that's something we should all remember. Now, there's a question about the most challenging missions, I think, in Africa. Am I right there? Clearly, the DRC would be pretty much high on the list. But I think you've gone through a lot of challenges in Darfur. I'm not familiar. I think the Central African Republic. Again, it's very interesting how you get these repeat missions. Central African Republic is this is the third or fourth set of missions. I still remember, some of you may have known him, the SRSG in Sierra Leone, Oluwadeniji, who became Foreign Minister of President Obasanjo. We were talking about after the about when to hold elections to renew the mandate of the government. And Olu was quite reluctant. And the reason he was reluctant was he said, look, we have to be careful. Because if we have a successful election, and Dimitri will remember this, we don't want to trigger the council saying, right, we've had an election, all's well, we're going to leave. Because he'd seen that had happened in the Central African Republic when he was the SRSG there, and it led to disaster, a recurring disaster. So I think we need to be careful how we judge missions and their success. There is, by the way, an interesting book, if you're in, Richard Kaplan, professor in Oxford University of International Relations, has just written and published a book on measuring peace and peace processes. And it is difficult. I struggle with that a lot. How do we say that we're making progress? Is it about the state of the state? Is it about DDR? Is it about the number of refugees returning and so forth? But I would say that certainly the DRC would be one, if not the most challenging, but 2 or 3 others that are lining up there. But we have had success, and that comes on to our colleague from Canada. Yeah, you know, and also look back to an earlier generation, Mozambique, for example, more short-lived, but in its time, even though it's Cambodia, it's some successes in other parts of the world, in Latin America. They weren't formal peacekeeping missions as such, as well as earlier versions in Africa itself. So it's true, it's a mixed record, but nevertheless, it's not been a record of failure by any means, by any means. It usually takes much longer, though, than we anticipate. That is very clear. We go on with these short-term mandates, and quite frankly, societies have broken down so badly, you're not going to, you know, put Humpty Dumpty together again in a matter of weeks or months. We're talking about, and I try to make that clear in the book, we're talking about fractures in society that go back not 10 years, they often go back several hundred years. And that doesn't mean to say we shouldn't try to do something about it, but I think we have to be realistic about what we can do in what time frame. And there is success, as I say. I mentioned a number of these missions with I think solid results considering the resources and the means at our disposal. And then when you see the amount of money, to be very honest, that's gone into Iraq and Afghanistan, okay, war fighting, you can argue, you realize that what we're spending in the UN through peacekeeping is peanuts, frankly, with, I think, reasonably good results over time because of the people, some of whom are in this room. Let me add that what we did well extends a whole range of issues within missions, you know, DDR, all these things, elements of peace building. But again, you know, experience has shown that we certainly need to strengthen in some areas. Finally, our colleague from Princeton raised the issue of the rise of more authoritarian, less democratic, less liberal regimes or political dispensations in Europe, some would argue in North America. I mean, to the extent that this raises issues about commitment to the international system, then yeah, we should be worried. And none of this works if there isn't, for example, as I said earlier, a minimum of understanding in the Security Council. If there isn't that, then I don't see that it can happen. You can't do missions around the Council. And by the way, that affects not just potentially new missions, but also existing missions. I remember well, we got into serious difficulty in Sierra Leone, in Côte d'Ivoire, and also in the DRC. But the Council was largely of one mind, and they backed us up. Without that, if the Council had started distributing favors to various groups and protagonists, we would have been in very serious difficulty. We were in difficulty, but quite frankly, those missions might have failed. And I think there's that danger there that, because, you know, governments and rebel groups and all are very clever at instrumentalizing different elements. They follow, they know what's happening in New York and elsewhere, and they know how to play off one against the other. And we went through that in several of the missions where, but fortunately the Council, I think, was generally in those missions reasonably supportive and of one mind. But without that, we would have really courted disaster.
And then there was one question on sexual abuse and exploitation,
yes,
and there is a section
absolutely.
in the book where you sort of lay out guidance to future
Second
SRSGs.
page, sorry. Yeah, that is crucial. You know, I actually, the very first big exposure on this was a story that Mark Doyle was then a BBC journalist, West Africa. Sex for Food, remember that? In 2000, 2001. Mm. And that was the start. It started in Liberia, but then the issue came to Sierra Leone. I mean, nothing is more damaging, frankly. And how a mission and an SRSG, frankly, handles that is absolutely crucial. Get it wrong, don't do the right thing, and frankly, you're going to have a lot of difficulties. It's about not just doing the right thing, but it's about understanding what is the right thing. And quite frankly, we've had a mixed record. Sadly, that tends to outweigh anything else we do, often in the headlines. But it's a fact, and we have to be responsible. And I really do believe that the SRSG's number one job is to deal with that. Mm-hmm. Because otherwise, you're crippled in all kinds of ways. You lose confidence, you lose support, and it becomes very hard to do it. And there are ways. I mean, for example, I never ever went to a medal parade, and I went to a lot, believe me, without talking about this issue. Sometimes with troops from very socially conservative societies who would be very uncomfortable, but it had to be said. And I made it very clear by what we meant by sexual exploitation. You know, gifts, sex for work, sex for jobs, sex for this, out of the question, that we will deal with it. We could deal with it much more effectively for civilians because they're under the Secretary General's direct disciplinary authority. It was much more difficult with, frankly, the uniformed part of the mission. Although in fairness, proportionately, the number of offences for sexual exploitation abuse was greater among the civilians than amongst the military. But of course, the military would get a lot of attention. And I'm afraid troop contributing countries have not always helped us on this, as you know. Some have deliberately obscured, others plead institutional processes, rule of law, due process, and too often that's become an excuse not to do anything. Others have moved more quickly. I cite a case in the book about where one country actually authorized, when we had this case, authorized its commander on the spot to hold court-martials in situ, to make the judgment public and to take action. That really did help us. That was very important for us. But too often, you know, these things drag on. I published statistics, for example. I had an independent panel review our policies. I had a joint agency mission group that reviewed every month where we were. I authorized our teams to go out and identify, did it quietly, to be honest, contingents that were most at risk, because we could see the numbers, you know, and to keep a very close eye on those. And where necessary, and I actually did do this, I can assure you, I even recommended contingents be removed if I saw recurring behavior. That usually produced a very quick response. And well-intentioned efforts to curb the abuses. The trouble is, after a few months, if you're not careful, old habits, bad habits die hard. Plus, you know, you've got a rotation every 6 months. If you think about it, there are about 100,000 uniformed peacekeepers. Most of them rotate every 6 months. So at any one time, you've got 200,000 to 300,000 people involved, either leaving, preparing, or in situ, right? And all of them have to go through the orientation, I think the DPO has made a major, well, no longer DPO, but made a major effort, you know, training, advice, SRSGs, force commanders, battalion commanders, sector commanders, etc. But it will always be there. Mm. It's the Brooklyn Bridge painting, you know. You just have to keep after it, you know. You get to one end, you start again. And it's not something that's ever going to disappear, to be honest, sadly. Zero tolerance doesn't mean, I'm afraid, zero compliance. But we have to try for zero tolerance. Because if you don't, you'll get much worse. So even though I don't think we'll ever get to 0-0, I hope we will, or I hope the UN will, just keep after it. Keep after it. Because if you don't, inexorably you will slide back. And I think an SRSG and a force commander have to lead the way on that and make sure it just keeps coming up, civilians as well as uniformed peacekeepers.
Alan, thank you very much. Please join in me. Thank you all.